On a stormy night in Kansas, a wounded horse staggered through the rain to a farmer's barn, its eyes burning with a plea no man could ignore. When Ethan Miller pried open the door he had vowed never to touch, he discovered a half-dead woman with secrets that powerful men would kill to bury. From that moment, his quiet life was over, and the fight for justice began. The wind howled across the endless Kansas prairie, carrying with it the heavy scent of wet earth and the metallic taste of lightning. Ethan Miller stood beneath the creaking porch of his farmhouse, a broad figure hunched against the storm. The fields he had worked with calloused hands lay blurred beneath sheets of rain, the neat rows of young corn vanishing into the darkness like soldiers swallowed by smoke. It should have been just another spring storm, one of many that carved itself into the land, but this one pressed differently, like an unwelcome memory pressing on his chest. Ethan had lived alone on this farm for over a decade, a man who had chosen silence over conversation, soil over society. His hair had gone from coal to steel gray, his eyes weathered like the barn he avoided looking at, the one that stood sagging at the edge of his land. That barn was not just wood and nails, it was a grave of sorts, holding the echoes of a son he had once buried in his heart. He hadn't opened its doors in years. He had no reason to. The storm swelled, lightning split the horizon, and in that split second of brilliance, Ethan saw movement out on the muddy road that cut across his fields. At first he thought it was a stray shadow, the ghostly shape of a tree swaying, but then it came closer, hoofbeats muffled by the rain, uneven, stumbling. A horse emerged, drenched, its flanks quivering under the strain of each step. It was no ordinary wanderer. The animal dragged one leg, the dark sheen of blood mixing with rain on its shoulder. Yet despite its injury, it kept moving with an urgency that was almost human. Its head bobbed low, then lifted sharply, eyes catching Ethan's like a plea. It stopped at the gate of his yard, sides heaving, then whinnied. A broken, trembling sound that was half pain, half command. Ethan's grip tightened on the porch railing. He had seen wounded animals before. The plains were full of them. Coyotes, deer, once even a bear limping through in winter. But this horse wasn't stumbling blindly. It was looking at him, watching him. It turned its head toward the barn, that barn. And then it looked back at him, ears flicking, eyes wide as if urging him. Ethan's chest tightened. No one, no living soul, had dared lead him back to those doors since the day he locked them. The horse snorted, shook its wet mane, and staggered 2 steps closer to the barn, then paused again, turning its head back toward him. The message was unmistakable. Ethan whispered hoarsely to no one. Why here? Why me? His voice was drowned by thunder, but his heart knew. The question was meant for himself. Lightning carved the sky once more, illuminating the horse, the barn behind it, and the rain-soaked fields stretching endlessly beyond. The world seemed to pause in that flash, as though fate itself had drawn a circle around this moment. Ethan stepped off the porch, boots sinking into the mud. The storm pressed harder, cold needles of rain slashing his skin. He could have turned away, could have closed the door and pretended the animal had never come. That would have been the easier path, the one he had chosen for years, turning away, locking doors, burying his grief in chores and silence. But the horse waited, shivering, eyes locked on him with a silent command that pierced deeper than any words. It was asking for something. No, demanding it. And Ethan Miller, a man who thought his soul long buried beneath the Kansas soil, felt his feet moving forward, step by step, toward the barn he had sworn never to open again. The rain had softened into a steady curtain by the time Ethan reached the gate, but the weight in the air had only grown heavier. The horse stood just beyond the posts, sides heaving, breath puffing in white bursts that the storm quickly tore away. Its coat, a rich chestnut under normal skies, looked almost black beneath the rain, plastered flat against ribs that rose and fell like bellows. Blood streaked its left shoulder, diluted by the downpour, yet the animal did not flinch away from him. It simply stared. Those eyes, dark, glassy pools wide with fear and something else, struck him harder than the wound. They were not wild or desperate like the gaze of a cornered creature. No, these eyes carried intention, a will that pinned him in place. Every time the horse blinked against the rain, it lifted its head toward the barn, then back to him. The rhythm was uncanny, as if it were begging, "Come." Not tomorrow. Now Ethan tightened the collar of his jacket, the storm running cold fingers down his neck. He had learned long ago to ignore calls for help. Not because he was heartless, he had once been the opposite, but because life had proven that answering could cost more than a man had left to give. When his wife's fever took her, when his boy was crushed in that very barn, he had promised himself never again. No more barns, no more rescues, just the land and his own 2 hands, until the Lord decided otherwise. Yet the horse did not relent. It limped toward the barn, hooves sinking into mud with a sickening squelch, then stopped and turned back. Its ears flicked, its nostrils flared, and it stomped once with its uninjured foreleg, a demand, not a plea. Thunder rumbled low, like a drumbeat echoing the animal's insistence. Ethan swore under his breath. He was no veterinarian, no savior, just a farmer with more ghosts than neighbors. But when the horse's legs buckled briefly and it caught itself with trembling effort, his chest constricted. He saw again his boy's legs crumpling beneath a heat. Young colt years ago, the panic in his son's eyes as life slipped away. He had been too slow that day, too late to stop it. The memory shoved him forward before he knew it. He unlatched the gate, the iron cold and slick in his grip, and stepped into the yard. The horse did not shy from him. Instead, it shuffled backward toward the barn, waiting for him to follow. Mud splashed against Ethan's boots, soaking his socks, but he barely felt it. All his attention was on those unblinking eyes. They seemed to ask more than he could possibly give. They seemed to know the weight he carried, the years of silence, the cracks in his soul. And still, they demanded. He wondered if God himself had sent this animal. An absurd thought for a man who hadn't prayed since his boy was lowered into the earth. The barn loomed larger with every step, its roof sagging, boards warped from neglect. Rain hammered the shingles in a rhythm that sounded almost like a heartbeat. Ethan slowed as he neared, every instinct screaming to turn back. He could still walk away. The horse might find its own way inside. Whatever waited in there could remain hidden forever. But the animal stopped short of the doors, planting itself like a sentinel. It let out a low whicker, soft and broken, a sound that burrowed into Ethan's chest and stirred something long buried. He stood frozen, staring at the warped wood of the barn doors, the place where laughter had once lived and died. The horse lowered its head, eyes never leaving his. And in that gaze, Ethan saw not just a plea for itself, But for whatever waited inside, something beyond his understanding, something that had chosen this storm, this night, and this man. He whispered again, almost against his will. "Why me?" The horse flicked its ears, rain dripping from its mane, and stepped aside, leaving the doors clear. Ethan's hand rose slowly, trembling, toward the iron handle that had not turned in years. The handle was colder than Ethan expected. Iron bitten by years of rain and neglect stung his palm, as though reminding him that some doors were meant to stay shut. The storm rattled the barn's siding, a groan rolling through the old beams, and for a heartbeat Ethan thought the building itself was resisting. His chest tightened. That door had been a tomb for his memories, his son's laughter echoing, then silenced in one sickening moment. He had sealed it after the funeral, swearing never to enter again. Yet here he was, trembling with his hand on the very threshold he had run from for more than a decade. Behind him, the horse shifted, hooves squelching in mud, breath ragged but patient. Its presence pressed him forward. Ethan turned the handle. The latch gave way with a moan that sounded too much like grief. As the door swung open, a rush of air escaped, thick with the smell of rot, hay, and thyme. Dust billowed, mixing with the rain's dampness, and the scent clawed at his throat. He blinked, half expecting to see his boy's silhouette in the shadows. But instead, he saw her. A woman, crumpled on a bed of straw near the far stall. Her hair, dark and tangled, clung to her face, streaked with mud. Her clothes were torn, her body curled protectively around a leather satchel as if it were the last piece of herself she could hold. For a moment, Ethan thought she was dead. He stepped closer, boots creaking against the warped planks, until he caught the faintest movement, the rise and fall of shallow breaths. The horse nickered softly, as though confirming what it had wanted him to find. Ethan crouched, his knees popping under the strain. The woman's skin was clammy, her lips pale. She stirred faintly when his shadow fell across her. Her eyelids fluttered, and for the briefest instant, her gaze met his. Brown eyes, glazed with exhaustion yet burning with urgency. Her cracked lips parted, and a whisper rasped out. Words nearly drowned by the storm hammering the roof. "They're poisoning the river." Then her head lolled to the side, and she slipped back into darkness. Ethan froze. Poisoning the river? What madness was this? He glanced at the satchel she clutched. It looked heavy. Worn, its seams frayed. One corner gaped open just enough for him to see papers stuffed inside, edges stained with water and dirt. Something about the way she clung to it told him it wasn't just scraps. It was truth, evidence, maybe even the reason she was here at all. He exhaled sharply, dragging a hand over his face. He had not signed up for this. He was a farmer, not a savior of strangers, not a man who chased conspiracies. And yet, the woman was here, in his barn, carried, or perhaps guided, by the very horse that had refused to leave him alone. The horse stepped inside, shaking itself violently, spraying droplets against the walls. It limped closer to the woman, lowered its head, and nuzzled her shoulder with a gentleness that made Ethan's chest ache. The animal whickered low, like a mother calling to a foal. Ethan understood then. This wasn't chance. They knew each other. The horse hadn't just found her. It had carried her here through the storm. Lightning flared through the gaps in the boards, illuminating her face again. She was young. No older than his son would have been had he lived. 20s, maybe 30. too young to be alone in the wilderness with enemies at her heels. Ethan's instincts screamed to shut the door, to leave them both, to walk back to the solitude he had so carefully constructed. But his hands betrayed him. He reached out, steadying her head, brushing hair away from her face. The simple contact cracked something in him. She was real. She was hurt. And she was depending on him, whether he wanted it or not. Thunder shook the barn, and outside the storm surged again. The sound masked Ethan's muttered words. "Lord help me, I can't turn away." He lifted the satchel from her slack arms, surprised by its weight, and slung it over his shoulder. Then, with an effort that sent pain shooting through his old spine, he gathered the woman into his arms. Her head fell against his chest, fragile as a child's. The horse stepped aside, watching with eyes that glistened in the dim light. For the first time in years, Ethan crossed the barn carrying more than tools or feed. He carried responsibility, heavy as any anvil he had ever worked at the forge. As he moved toward the door, he glanced back at the stalls, at the shadows where his boy had once laughed, once fallen. The ghosts did not vanish, but they shifted. For the first time, the barn held something else, something alive, something worth protecting. Outside, the storm did not relent. But within Ethan, a door had already begun to open wider than the one he had just unlatched. Ethan laid the woman gently onto the old bench that leaned against the barn wall. The wood creaked beneath her weight, fragile as though it hadn't carried a body in years. He could hear the storm less now, muffled by the barn's thick walls, but its presence was still everywhere. Wind rushing through cracks, rain drumming above, thunder rolling in distant waves. The horse lingered nearby, stamping its hooves softly, restless yet unwilling to leave her side. Her face looked younger in the lantern light he had lit, a pale glow that spread weakly across the stalls. She was no hardened traveler, at least not in appearance. Mud streaked her cheeks, a cut traced her brow, and her lips were cracked, as though she had gone too long without water. When Ethan lifted one limp hand, he was startled by the ink stains at her fingertips. Not a farm girl's hand, nor a drifter's. The fingers were slim, marked by writing, not soil. He sighed, muttering to himself, "Lord above, what mess have you dragged to me this time?" The horse flicked its ears, head lowering close to the woman's face, and nudged her with the tenderness of kin. She stirred at the touch, lashes trembling before her eyes slowly opened, brown, rich and deep, dulled by exhaustion but holding a spark of something unyielding. She focused on Ethan, confusion flashing across her features before she whispered in a voice roughened by thirst. Where am I?" Ethan hesitated, then answered plainly. "My farm, Kansas Plains. You're safe. For now." Her gaze darted toward the satchel still slung over his shoulder. She made a weak attempt to reach for it, but the movement cost her. She gasped, clutching her ribs, and pain washed across her face. Ethan crouched lower, his voice softer than he expected it could be. "Don't push yourself. You need rest." Her lips quivered, then steadied with determination. "No, not rest. You must understand." Her voice broke, but she pressed on. "They're poisoning the Arkansas River. The people here, families, children, they don't even know." Ethan's brow furrowed. He had heard whispers before. Rumors that men with polished boots and moneyed voices had come sniffing around neighboring farms. But poison? That sounded like a tale told by drunks at the saloon. Still, her urgency made it hard to dismiss. She lifted a hand again, pointing feebly at the satchel. Ethan placed it beside her, watching as she clung to it as if it were her lifeline. "Inside," she rasped. "Proof. Reports, letters, names. They'll kill to keep it hidden." The words settled heavy in the barn, heavier even than the storm pressing against the walls. Kill. It had been years since Ethan heard the word spoken with such raw certainty. He felt his jaw tighten, old instincts stirring beneath the soil he had buried them under. "Who's after you?" he asked quietly. She swallowed hard, closing her eyes as if gathering strength. "A company. Railroads and mining join together. They buy land, force others off it. And where they can't buy," she faltered, then forced the word out. "They destroy." The horse pawed the ground, snorting as though in agreement. Ethan realized suddenly that the animal bore its wound not by chance. Someone had tried to stop it, from saving her, from reaching him. The realization twisted his stomach. She shifted, wincing, and added, "My name is Clara Dawson. I'm a reporter. I've been following them for months. They think they silenced me." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "But I'm still here." Ethan studied her for a long moment. He didn't know her, didn't know if her story was truth or fevered fantasy. But the horse's loyalty spoke volumes. He had always believed animals sensed what humans often ignored. And this one had brought her here, through storm and pain, to his barn. "Clara," he said, testing the name. She opened her eyes again, faint gratitude flickering there. He rose slowly, walking a few paces away, his boots echoing against the boards. He pressed his hand against one of the stalls, staring at the grain of the wood as if it could answer him. He had promised himself a life without entanglements. No more saving, no more losing. Yet here was this stranger, bleeding truth onto his floor, dragging with her a storm greater than the one outside. Behind him, Clara's voice cracked through the quiet. "Please. If I don't make it, someone has to carry it forward. The river, the children." He turned back sharply, seeing the weight in her eyes. She wasn't begging for herself. She was begging for everyone else. For a long moment, Ethan said nothing. Then, with a heaviness in his chest that felt like old armor settling back onto his shoulders, he nodded once. "You'll live," he said firmly, though he wasn't sure if it was a promise or a prayer. "And while you're here, nobody touches you." The horse blew out a long breath, almost a sigh of relief, before settling near the stall door, keeping its vigil. Clara clutched the satchel to her chest, and though her body trembled, Ethan saw the faintest glimmer of peace wash over her face. The storm raged on, but inside the barn, something new had taken root. A fragile alliance born not of choice, but of need. The lantern flickered against the damp wood, throwing long shadows across the barn. Clara had slipped back into uneasy sleep, her breathing shallow but steady. The satchel still clutched against her chest like a shield. Ethan stood over her for a moment, the weight of her words lingering. Poisoned rivers, companies that would kill to stay hidden. He wanted to dismiss them as fever dreams, but the blood staining her shirt was real enough. And so was the gash along the horse's flank, raw and ugly, oozing where rain hadn't already washed it clean. Ethan's hands moved before his mind caught up. He gathered rags, a tin of boiled water he kept in the house, and the half-empty jar of ointment that had sat untouched since the last time one of his own animals cut itself on barbed wire. The smell of camphor and herbs filled the barn, sharp and medicinal. He approached the horse first. The animal shifted when he neared, ears flicking back, but its eyes softened the moment he whispered, "Easy now." You've done your part. Let me do mine." His voice cracked at the end, betraying the emotions he thought long buried. He pressed the rag to the wound, cleaning mud and blood, his rough fingers steady as they had once been at the forge. The horse flinched, but did not pull away. Instead, it lowered its head until its muzzle rested against his shoulder, warm breath ghosting over his collar. Something in the gesture broke him open. It was too much like the nights long ago when his boy had cried over a scraped knee, and Ethan had knelt with the same ointment, the same words of comfort. "You're all right, son. Just a scratch. You'll be strong again." Except one night, it hadn't been just a scratch. Except one night, no words had been enough. He clenched his jaw, blinking hard against the memory. The horse exhaled as if sensing the crack in his armor, steadying him instead of the other way around. When the wound was dressed, Ethan turned to Clara. He hesitated, jar of ointment in one hand, rag in the other. She was a stranger, fragile, but the sight of her curled so small on the bench stirred the same instinct the horse had awakened. He crouched low, brushed damp hair from her brow, and gently unbuttoned her sleeve to reveal the angry bruise spreading across her ribs. She groaned faintly, but did not wake. He worked silently, binding her side with strips of cloth torn from an old flour sack. Each knot he tied reminded him of binding his wife's shawl around her shoulders when the fever stole her warmth. The sound of her coughing still haunted him, the helplessness of watching her slip away as medicine failed. His hands trembled as he tied the final knot on Clara's bandage, and he forced himself to breathe. The storm outside had quieted, leaving only the drip of water from the eaves and the occasional groan of the barn. Beams. In that hush, Ethan felt the company of ghosts pressing closer. His wife's voice, his son's laughter, the silence that followed. He had built walls against them for years, but tonight, with this stranger under his care and the wounded horse standing watch, the walls felt thin. He rose and leaned against the post by the stall, staring at the two lives now bound to his. He could almost hear his wife's voice again, whispering the words she had spoken on her last night. "Don't turn away from suffering, Ethan. Turning away is the only true sin." He had hated her for saying that, hated the impossible weight of it. But now, seeing Clara clutch the satchel even in sleep, he wondered if she had been right all along. His eyes drifted to the satchel. He wanted to open it, to see what truths it held, but something held him back. Perhaps fear of knowing too much, of being drawn into something he could not walk away from, or perhaps respect, that the secrets belonged to her until she was strong enough to share them. Either way, he left it untouched. The horse shifted in the straw, lowering itself gingerly onto the ground. Its body curved protectively toward Clara, as though it understood its duty was not yet over. Ethan felt a strange kinship with the animal, both of them scarred, both unwilling participants in a story that was already unfolding. He doused the lantern halfway, leaving the barn in a softer glow. The air smelled of rain-soaked earth, ointment, and hay. Ethan sat on an overturned bucket, elbows on his knees, watching over them. He told himself it was only for the night, that when dawn came, the woman would move on, and he would return to his solitude. But deep down he knew the truth. Something had shifted. The wounds he dressed tonight were not only theirs, they were his. And for the first time in years, he wondered if they might begin to heal. Dawn seeped through the gaps in the barn siding, thin streaks of gray light cutting across the straw. Ethan had dozed in fits, his head bowed against the post, but the horse's restless shifting woke him before the sun fully crested. Clara stirred on the bench, her fingers still curled tightly around the satchel. When her eyes fluttered open, there was no haze of fever this time, only a grim clarity. She looked at him as if weighing whether he was an ally or just another witness who might turn her in. "You should have left me," she rasped, her voice hoarse but steadier than the night before. "Would have been safer for you." Ethan didn't answer immediately. He poured water into a tin cup, pressed it into her hand. She drank in slow sips, wincing with every swallow, but her gaze never left his. Finally, he said, "That horse thought otherwise. Dragged you here like it knew I'd listen." Clara's lips curved faintly, a shadow of a smile that looked foreign on her bruised face. She reached out with trembling fingers to touch the horse's muzzle. "Autumn," she cummed, whispered. "She's the reason I'm alive." The animal nickered softly, eyes closing at the sound of its name. Ethan realized then that Clara and the horse had traveled a long road together, a bond forged in hardship. The barn fell quiet, but for the horse's breathing. Clara shifted, pulling the satchel into her lap. Her hands shook as she loosened the straps, revealing stacks of folded papers bound with twine. The top sheet was stained, the ink smudged, but Ethan could still make out words like contamination, mercury, and river samples. He frowned, his stomach tightening. "They've been dumping waste from their operations straight into the Arkansas River," Clara explained, her voice low but urgent. "Fish are dying. Wells are turning foul. Families don't know why their children are sick. And the company's men," she broke off, swallowing hard, "they silence anyone who asks too many questions." Ethan leaned back against the post, his jaw tightening. He had heard of companies buying up land, but poisoning water? That was worse than neglect. It was cruelty dressed as progress. Clara's eyes met his, fierce despite her frailty. "I thought I could expose them," she said. "I followed their wagons, collected samples, interviewed families. I thought if I had enough evidence, someone in Topeka or Washington would listen. But I underestimated how far they'd go. They caught me outside a camp 2 nights ago. Autumn fought to get me free. She took the bullet that was meant for me, then carried me until she found you." Her voice cracked on the last words. She pressed the papers to her chest like a prayer book. "If they find me here, they'll kill me." And anyone who helps me, Ethan's first instinct was to bristle. He had spent 15 years building walls to keep trouble out, burying himself in soil and sweat. Now this stranger, with her ink-stained fingers and desperate truths, was asking him to open every door he'd sealed. He wanted to tell her no, to walk away. But the horse's eyes lingered on him, steady and knowing, and Clara's voice carried the same echo of his wife's last plea. "Don't turn away from suffering." "You expect me to believe all this?" he asked quietly. Clara didn't flinch. "No, I expect you to look around, to remember the neighbors who lost livestock last spring, to recall the taste of your own well water when it turned bitter for weeks. This isn't just my fight, Mr. Miller. It's yours too, whether you want it or not." Her words hit harder than he liked. He remembered pouring buckets of water for his corn, the metallic tang he couldn't explain. He remembered the Henderson boy coughing for weeks, the Thompsons selling off cattle after half their herd collapsed. Maybe he had chosen not to see. Maybe solitude had blinded him to the truth creeping into his valley. Clara leaned back, spent from speaking, but her eyes never wavered. My father used to say the truth is like water. You can dam it for a while, but it always finds its way through. If I die, these papers have to keep moving. Will you promise me that? Ethan looked at her, then at the horse stretched beside the stall, its wound still raw but its spirit unbroken. He wanted to refuse, but the word died in his throat. Instead, he found himself nodding once, heavy as a vow. Rest, he said. We'll figure what comes next when you have strength. For the first time since he'd opened the barn door, Clara closed her eyes without clutching the satchel. The horse settled too, lowering its head to the straw. Ethan remained standing, his hand pressed against the post, feeling the weight of a decision already taking root. He had thought the barn was only filled with ghosts. Now it held something else, a truth too dangerous to ignore, and a woman who had carried it this far with nothing but ink, courage, and a wounded horse to shield her. By mid-morning the storm had passed, leaving the Kansas prairie washed clean yet unsettled, like a battlefield after smoke clears. The air smelled of wet earth and cedar, sharp and heavy, and Ethan knew the quiet would not last. Trouble rarely traveled alone, and if Clara's pursuers had lost her trail in the storm, they'd pick it up again soon enough. He couldn't keep her hidden here without help. He saddled his oldest gelding, the only horse besides Autumn that remained on the farm. The leather creaked, worn thin from years of disuse. Clara stirred when she saw him preparing. "Where are you going?" she asked, voice still fragile but edged with alarm. "To fetch an old friend," Ethan said simply. Her eyes narrowed. "Can you trust him?" Ethan didn't answer right away. He thought of Harold Green, the town's doctor, a man whose silence had been his truest companion these last 15 years. They hadn't shared much beyond a game of chess and quiet cups of coffee, but sometimes friendship was found in what wasn't said. "He's one of the few I'd bet my life on," Ethan said at last, and Clara seemed satisfied. He rode the muddy track toward town, every hoofbeat pulling up memories he'd buried with the same determination he buried fence posts. The open plains stretched endlessly, dotted with cottonwoods bowing under the weight of the storm's passing. By the time he reached Doc Green's clapboard house, Ethan's coat was dry, but his mind was soaked with unease. Harold opened the door before Ethan even knocked, as though he had been waiting. His face, long and weathered, broke into lines of surprise. "Well, I'll be damned." "Thought you'd sworn off visitors for good. Need your hands, Doc," Ethan said without preamble. "There's a woman hurt bad." "And a horse worse off." The doctor didn't hesitate. He grabbed his black bag from the hook, slung his coat over one shoulder, and locked the door behind him. "If you came, Ethan, it must be serious. Let's go back at the farm." Doc moved through the barn with the calm of a man who'd patched wounds on both men and beasts since the war. He checked Clara first, peeling back bandages Ethan had clumsily tied. "You did what you could," he said softly, rewrapping her ribs with practiced precision. "She'll live if she rests." Clara's eyes opened briefly. "Doc Green," she whispered. "They'll come." The company. They won't stop, Doc's brow furrowed. He looked from her to Ethan, then back, but asked no questions. Instead, he turned to Autumn, kneeling beside the mare's wounded flank. His hands worked quickly, steady as stone, stitching where the flesh had torn. Autumn stood rigid, but still, as though she recognized the difference between cruelty and care. When he finished, he patted her neck. "This one's tougher than most men I know," he murmured. Ethan stood back, watching the two patients breathe easier under Doc's touch. He had almost forgotten what it felt like to share responsibility with someone else. It lightened the load, though only slightly, like shifting a sack of grain from one shoulder to another. But peace never lasted long. Late in the afternoon, the crunch of hooves echoed on the distant road. Ethan froze. Doc looked up sharply. Clara stiffened, clutching the satchel to her chest. Autumn raised her head, ears pricked, nostrils flaring. Ethan stepped to the barn door, peering through a gap in the boards. 3 riders were moving slow along the ridge, too neat in their formation to be cowhands, too polished in their coats to be neighbors. He recognized the look. Hired men, the kind who carried guns not for ranching but for silence. "They're here," Clara whispered. Doc closed his bag with a snap, his voice calm but firm. "You'll need more than me now." Ethan knew what he meant. There was one other man whose judgment carried weight in these parts, Sheriff Cole Harris. Practical, cautious, but fair. Ethan hadn't spoken to him in years. The sheriff had once asked him to return to law work, and Ethan had refused, slamming that door the same way he slammed the barns. But some doors, it seemed, refused to stay closed. "I'll bring him," Ethan said. His voice carried a steadiness he hadn't felt in years, though inside, his chest was heavy with dread. Clara's eyes searched his, uncertain. "Will he stand with you?" Ethan didn't answer right away. He thought of Cole's badge, gleaming in the sun, and of the shadows cast by money and power. The sheriff had always walked a line between justice and compromise. Whether he would tip one way or the other now, that remained to be seen. As Ethan stepped outside into the lengthening light, the prairie stretched wide and unforgiving before him. Behind him, in the barn, rested a woman with a satchel full of dangerous truth, a horse marked by sacrifice, and an old doctor who knew the cost of silence. Ahead lay the sheriff, the Matsuran, law, and a question that had haunted Ethan for years. When the time came, would he stand and fight or turn away again? The sky dimmed early that evening, as if the storm had left its shadow behind. The horizon glowed faintly red where the sun sank, but the light bled quickly into darkness. Ethan guided his gelding along the ridge road toward town, the wind cool against his face, his mind turning over questions he didn't want answered. He thought of Clara's papers, of the names scrawled across them, of children drinking poisoned water without knowing. He thought of the riders who had paused on the ridge, searching. Their patience was dangerous. Wolves never rushed their prey. When he reached Cedar Bluff, the town lay quiet, lanterns flickering in windows, smoke curling from chimneys. The saloon's piano carried a thin tune through the evening air, out of step with the weight pressing on Ethan's chest. He dismounted at the sheriff's office, a squat building wedged between the livery and the mercantile. The wooden sign creaked above the door, its paint long since faded. Sheriff Cole Harris was inside, hunched over a desk littered with papers. He looked up as Ethan stepped through the door, and his eyes widened with something between relief and suspicion. "Well," Cole said slowly, "I never thought you'd walk into my office again." Ethan didn't waste time. "I've got a problem, Cole. And if you don't help me, the whole valley's gonna have one too." The sheriff leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "That's a hell of an opening after 15 years of silence. What's this about?" Ethan told him in clipped words, the woman, the poisoned river, the company's men sniffing around. Cole listened without interrupting, his jaw tightening as the story unfolded. When Ethan finished, silence hung between them, broken only by the tick of the clock on the wall. Finally, Cole exhaled. "Damn it, Ethan. I've heard whispers, families losing cattle, wells going sour, But I don't have proof, just complaints. And you show up with a reporter half dead in your barn, and a story that could burn the whole territory." He rubbed his temples. "Do you know what you're asking me to do?" "I'm asking you to do your job," Ethan said. His voice was low, steady, but edged with steel. The sheriff stared at him, then at the badge pinned to his own chest. "You think I don't want to?" "These people, this company, they're backed by money and men from back east. They've got lawyers, investors, even politicians leaning on me. If I make the wrong move, I'll have half the town turned against me before the week's out." Ethan leaned closer. "If you make no move, you'll have graves instead. Children's graves." The words landed heavy. Cole's eyes flickered, and for a moment Ethan saw the younger man he remembered, the deputy who once believed justice was clear and worth bleeding for. But then the sheriff's gaze hardened again, practical and weary. "I'll ride out tomorrow," Cole said finally. "See for myself. If what you're saying holds water, I'll decide then." It wasn't the answer Ethan wanted, but it was all he'd get. He nodded once, turned, and left, without another word. The ride back was long, the prairie cloaked in night. The wind carried scents of sage and damp soil, but also something else: smoke. Ethan slowed his horse, scanning the distance. Far off, near his valley, faint plumes rose against the stars. His stomach knotted. By the time he reached his farm, the barn loomed like a sentinel in the dark. No flames, but the air carried the acrid bite of burned wood. Someone had tried to light a fire near the back wall, leaving blackened streaks across the siding. Ethan's pulse surged. They had come while he was gone. Inside, Clara sat upright, pale but alert, the satchel clutched in her lap. Doc Green sat on a stool beside her, his rifle resting across his knees. Autumn stood in the stall, ears sharp, nostrils flared. They had all been waiting. "They circled," Doc said quietly. "6 riders. Tried to scare us. One lit a torch, but the horse drove him off before he got close." Ethan looked at Autumn. The mare's eyes burned with defiance, her sides still heaving from exertion. He imagined her charging at the intruder despite her wound, forcing him back into the dark. He laid a hand on her damp neck. "Good girl," he whispered. Clara's voice broke the silence. "They won't stop, Ethan. They know I'm alive. They'll be back, and next time they won't just scare us." He met her eyes. There was no fever there now, only certainty. She wasn't asking for rescue anymore. She was warning him. Ethan glanced at Doc, then at the scarred barn wall, then back to Clara. The shadows were gathering, not just outside, but in the very heart of their valley. And for the first time in 15 years, he felt the old weight settle on his shoulders, the choice between turning away or standing against the dark. The night pressed close around the barn, thick with the scent of smoke and damp hay. Ethan had left the lanterns dim, letting the dark hide their presence, but inside, no one truly rested. Clara sat with her back against the bench, the satchel pressed to her chest. Doc Green dozed in the corner, with the rifle balanced on his knees, though Ethan knew his friend's ears were sharp even in sleep. And Autumn did not close her eyes at all. The mare stood tall in the stall, wounded flank twitching, ears swiveling at every sound the prairie carried. Ethan leaned against the doorframe, the weight of his revolver heavy on his hip. He had not worn it in years. Not like this. But tonight, the leather felt familiar against his thigh. He could almost hear the click of a hammer pulled back in memory. The smell of gunpowder and fear thick in his nose. He had promised himself he would never return to that life. But the fire scars on the barn wall reminded him the world had a way of dragging men back, whether they were willing or not. A sudden crack outside, the snap of a twig beneath a boot, sent Autumn's head jerking up. Her eyes glowed faintly in the lantern light, reflecting not fear but fury. Ethan's own body went taut. He gestured to Doc, who stirred instantly, rifle rising. Clara pressed herself flatter against the wall, whispering, "They've come back." Ethan crept to the narrow slit between boards, peering into the night. The prairie stretched wide and empty, but he caught a flicker of movement, shadows slipping between cottonwoods at the edge of his land. More than one, moving carefully. The kind of careful that spoke of men who knew violence well. He turned back to the horse. Autumn pawed the straw, tail lashing, the whites of her eyes bright. She remembered. She remembered the torch, the danger, the scent of men who meant harm. Her breath came fast, fogging in the cold air, but her stance was solid, as though daring the night to test her again. Ethan saw something in her then. Not just an animal's instinct, but a fire, raw and unbroken. The riders did not rush. They circled again. Unseen but felt, their silence louder than gunfire. Hours seemed to pass, measured by Autumn's restless shifting. Then, near midnight, the first whistle pierced the quiet, a shrill, mocking sound that echoed across the pasture. Ethan stiffened. Another whistle answered, farther off. They were testing him, probing, reminding him that the farm was surrounded. Ethan whispered low, more to himself than anyone else, "Cowards won't come straight." But Autumn stamped hard, shaking her mane, eyes blazing. Clara saw it too. She leaned forward, her face pale in the lantern light. "She wants to fight," she murmured. Ethan almost laughed at the absurdity of it, a horse wanting to fight men with guns. And yet, as he looked at Autumn, he realized it wasn't absurd at all. She had already carried Clara through a gauntlet of fire, had already driven one man back with nothing but teeth and hooves. Her loyalty was absolute, her courage contagious. The whistles stopped. Silence fell again, heavy as stone. Then came the sound of hooves pounding against earth, fast, deliberate. They were charging this time. Ethan shoved the barn door wider, stepped out into the yard with his revolver drawn. Moonlight washed the fields in silver. 6 riders thundered toward him from different angles, torches blazing in 2 hands. The acrid scent of kerosene reached him even before the fire did. He raised his revolver, steady as the man he had once been, and fired. One torch flew from a rider's grip, spinning into the mud where it hissed and died. Chaos erupted. Bullets cracked. Wood splintered around the barn door, and Autumn screamed, a piercing cry that seemed to split the night. She burst from the stall, ignoring her wound, hooves pounding the boards until they gave way. Ethan turned just as the mare surged into the yard, mane flying, eyes blazing with an intensity that froze even the riders mid-charge. She drove straight into the path of the nearest man, rearing high, hooves slamming down. The rider's horse panicked, veering aside, throwing its master into the dirt. Gunfire erupted fully now. Doc Green fired from the barn door, dropping one man's hat clean off his head and sending him scrambling. Clara crouched low, clutching the satchel, but her eyes locked on Autumn. The mare fought as though she understood every life in the barn depended on her. She dodged, struck, bit, and kicked, a force of fury that scattered the attacker's neat formation. Ethan fired again, his shot grazing another rider's arm. The man howled, spinning away. Torches flew wild, landing harmlessly in the wet grass. The attackers had come to frighten, maybe to burn, but they had not expected resistance, certainly not from a horse with fire in her eyes. The skirmish lasted minutes, though it stretched like hours. When silence finally fell, 2 riders lay groaning in the mud, and the rest galloped back into the dark, their bravado gone. Ethan lowered his revolver, his chest heaving. Doc Green stepped out, smoke curling from the rifle barrel, his face pale but resolute. And Autumn. Autumn stood in the center of the yard, sides heaving, wound reopened and bleeding, but her eyes still fierce, still burning. She turned her head toward Ethan, ears flicking forward as if to ask, "Did I do enough?" Ethan walked to her slowly, holstered his revolver, and pressed a hand against her trembling neck. "More than enough," he whispered. His throat tightened, his eyes stung, but he didn't look away. For the first time since his boy had died, he allowed himself to feel pride without pain. Inside the barn, Clara's voice broke the quiet. "She's the reason we're alive." No one argued. They all knew it was true. The prairie smelled of blood and smoke when the last hoofbeats faded into the night. Ethan stood in the yard with his revolver hanging limp at his side, the weight of the gun suddenly unbearable. Doc Green knelt over one of the fallen riders, who groaned in the mud, muttering curses between clenched teeth. The man's arm hung twisted, useless, but his eyes burned with a defiance that chilled Ethan more than the night air. This wasn't over. Not by a long stretch. Inside the barn, Clara pushed herself upright, clutching the satchel so tightly her knuckles whitened. She had heard the fight, every gunshot, every scream, and though her body trembled, her face was carved with resolve. "They'll come again," she said, her voice raw. "And next time they won't scatter." Ethan didn't answer. His gaze had turned to Autumn. The mare's flanks were streaked with blood where her wound had torn open, and her sides rose and fell like bellows. Yet she stood tall, ears forward, eyes blazing as though daring the night to test her again. Pride welled in Ethan's chest, but it was tangled with guilt. She had carried too much, asked for nothing, and still had thrown herself into danger to protect them. He laid a hand on her neck, and the heat beneath his palm was a reminder that even the strongest fire could burn out. Doc joined him, wiping blood from his hands onto a rag. "She needs stitches redone, and rest. If you keep pushing her, she won't make it through another night like this." Ethan nodded grimly. His own strength felt no steadier than the horse's. By morning, the town had heard. News traveled faster than bullets in Kansas, and whispers carried into the sheriff's office before the sun fully rose. Sheriff Cole rode out before noon, his badge glinting dully against his vest. He found Ethan in the yard, patching the barn wall where bullets had chewed the wood. Cole dismounted slowly, as if the very air weighed heavy. "I heard you had visitors," Cole said, his voice flat. "More than visitors," Ethan replied without looking up. 6 men with torches and bullets. They wanted to leave nothing standing. The sheriff sighed, removing his hat and running a hand through his hair. "I warned you. These aren't drifters. They're hired hands with pay rolling in from back east. They'll bleed you dry before they let you hand over those papers." Clara stepped into the doorway then, her voice sharp. "And what will you do, Sheriff?" "Keep watching while they poison families. How many children have to drink death before you decide your badge means something?" Cole's face hardened, but he didn't raise his voice. I'm not blind, Miss Dawson. But I'm not reckless either. You think standing against them is brave. I call it suicide without allies. Ethan straightened from the barn wall, meeting Cole's eyes. You wore that badge to stand when it mattered. If this isn't one of those times, what is? The sheriff's jaw clenched. He looked from Ethan to Clara, then to Autumn standing silently nearby, her head high despite the bandages. The weight of their gaze unsettled him. For a moment he seemed about to speak, but instead he muttered, I'll think on it, and turned back to his horse. Ethan watched him ride away, dust curling in the afternoon sun, and something inside him cracked. He had hoped Cole would stand firm, that the law would not waver. Instead, doubt had crept in where certainty once lived. That night, silence pressed harder than the storm had. Clara sat cross-legged on the bench, spreading papers across the floor, tracing each line of ink as if afraid they'd vanish. Doc dozed again, though his rifle stayed close, and Ethan sat with his back against Autumn's stall, his hand resting on her warm flank. The mare shifted, pressing her weight gently against him, and he closed his eyes. Memories came unbidden, his wife coughing in their bed, his son's laughter echoing through the barn, the silence that followed when both were gone. He had turned away then, shut doors, buried himself in soil. But tonight, the doors refused to stay closed. Clara's voice replayed in his mind. They'll come again. Sheriff Cole's doubt echoed after it. Ethan opened his eyes. Autumn watched him, her gaze steady, unyielding, a flicker of fire even in exhaustion. In that gaze, he saw what the sheriff lacked: certainty. She didn't need to weigh options or calculate risks. She had chosen already, and Ethan realized with a jolt that the horse's faith had become stronger than his own. He whispered into the dark, not sure if he was speaking to Autumn, to Clara, or to ghosts. Maybe it's time I choose too. The barn smelled of smoke and medicine, a mixture Ethan had grown used to over the last days, though it never sat comfortably in his lungs. Clara slept restlessly on the bench, one hand still curled over her satchel, as if her dreams themselves were guarded by it. Doc Green had taken a cot in the corner, snoring lightly, his rifle leaned against the post within reach. Autumn shifted in her stall, hoof scraping straw, eyes half closed but never quite surrendering to rest. Ethan sat alone at the workbench, a lantern glowing faintly beside him. In his hands lay a box he hadn't opened in 15 years. The hinges squealed when he lifted the lid, as if even they objected. Inside lay his revolver belt, polished by time, a marshal's badge dulled to a faint sheen, and a handful of letters he'd sworn never to read again. His fingers brushed the badge, and for a moment he couldn't breathe. He had once worn it proudly, a symbol of justice, of duty. Then came the war, the outlaws, the blood, too much blood, and the fever that stole his wife while he was away chasing thieves. After that, the badge had meant nothing but failure. He had folded it away like a burial shroud, vowing never to be that man again. But Clara's words haunted him. They'll come again. Sheriff Cole's hesitation gnawed at him, too. And Autumn, her eyes had burned brighter than any badge. He had seen more courage in her wounded defiance than in all the lawmen who carried stars these days. He lifted the badge now, its weight deceptively small. Memories came unbidden, nights spent on patrol, his son running to the porch when he returned home, his wife brushing dust from his coat. He had sworn an oath then, an oath to protect the innocent, to stand between harm and those who could not fight back. He had broken that oath when he turned his back on the world. His reflection stared back at him from the tarnished metal. Older, wearier, but not dead. He set the badge against his chest and closed his eyes. For the first time in years, he whispered the words he had once spoken before a judge, barely audible, but sharp as a blade. To uphold justice, to protect the innocent, to turn away from no man's suffering. The words shook something loose in him. He wasn't sure if it was strength or grief. A soft sound broke the moment. Clara had woken, watching him through the dim light. Her face was pale, but her eyes burned, reflecting the same fire he felt inside. "You were law once," she said quietly. Ethan nodded slowly. "A long time ago." "And now?" He fastened the badge to his vest, the motion both foreign and familiar. "Now it seems the law has found me again." Clara's lips curved faintly, though her voice trembled. "Then maybe we stand a chance." Autumn shifted in her stall, letting out a low whicker that sounded almost like agreement. Ethan glanced at her, the mare's gaze steady, as if she too recognized the change in him. She had carried Clara to his door, faced down fire and gunmen, and never faltered. Now it was his turn. He holstered the revolver at his side, buckled the belt tight, and felt the old weight settle against his hip. It was heavier than he remembered, not because of the leather or steel, but because of what it demanded of him. This time, if he chose to stand, there could be no turning back. The lantern hissed softly, flame shrinking low. Outside, the prairie stretched vast and silent, but Ethan knew shadows gathered still, waiting for the right moment. He rose from the bench, his hand brushing the mare's mane as he passed. "You showed me what it means to stand, girl," he murmured. "I won't waste it." Clara's eyes followed him, filled with something he hadn't seen in years. Not trust exactly, but hope. And Ethan, for the first time since his son's laughter had faded, felt the faintest stir of purpose strong enough to drown out the ghosts. The day broke sharp and brittle, the kind of morning where every sound carried clear across the prairie. Ethan stood outside the barn with the badge pinned beneath his coat, the revolver on his hip, and the weight of inevitability pressing down like a storm not yet seen. Clara watched him from the doorway, the satchel strapped across her shoulder, her face still pale, but her eyes steady. Doc Green tightened the bandage on Autumn's flank, murmuring words of comfort as if to convince himself as much as the mare. By mid-morning, dust rose on the horizon. It wasn't a single rider this time. It was many. Ethan counted at least a dozen shapes, moving in disciplined formation, too organized for cattle hands. They rode with the arrogance of men who believed themselves unstoppable, their rifles slung casual but ready, their voices carrying like thunder before the storm. "Company men," Clara whispered, her knuckles white on the satchel strap. Ethan felt a calm settle over him. Not peace, but the stillness before a blade strikes. He had lived through sieges before, though not like this. Back then, he fought with other men at his side, a marshal's star shining in daylight, the certainty of law behind him. Now, he stood with a worn-out doctor, a half-healed reporter, and a wounded mare who had more fight in her than most soldiers he'd known. The riders stopped just beyond rifle range. Their leader, a man in a dark coat and polished boots, stepped forward. His smile was practiced, the kind that hid knives. "Mr. Miller," he called, his voice smooth. "We've heard you're harboring stolen property. Hand it over, and no harm comes to your farm." Clara's voice trembled with rage. Stolen property? You mean the truth you buried? The man ignored her. His gaze stayed fixed on Ethan. This doesn't concern you. You're a farmer, nothing more. Step aside, and we'll forget you were involved. Ethan's hand brushed the badge under his coat. He stepped forward, his voice even. You've already concerned me. This land, this river, you poisoned them. That makes it my fight. The leader's smile faltered. He raised a hand, and the riders fanned out, encircling the farm like wolves closing on a wounded animal. Ethan felt his pulse quicken, but he forced calm into his movements. He nodded to Doc, who lifted his rifle. Clara crouched inside the barn, eyes fierce behind her fear. Autumn stamped the earth, ears pinned back, ready despite the bandage. The first shots came suddenly, cracking through the morning. Splinters flew from the barn wall, and Ethan dropped behind the water trough, revolver steady in his grip. Doc's rifle barked in answer, the shot echoing across the valley. One rider toppled from his saddle, and the rest scattered, circling tighter. The siege began. For hours they pressed, shots trading across the yard, the sound rolling into the hills like distant thunder. Ethan's hands remembered every motion. Loading, aiming, firing. Each movement etched into his muscles from years he thought lost. Doc worked with calm precision, his old surgeon's focus steady even under fire. Clara darted between shadows, carrying ammunition, her satchel pressed close as if its contents were as vital as her heart. And Autumn refused to stay hidden. She forced her way into the yard when one rider drew too close, charging with a ferocity that sent his horse veering wide. Bullets hissed past her, one grazing her flank. But she didn't falter. Her scream split the air, fierce and wild, a sound that shook even hardened men. As the sun sank, the attackers grew bolder. Twice they tried to rush the barn doors, and twice Ethan drove them back, the Colt hot in his hand. But their numbers pressed heavy. Every time one fell, another seemed to appear. The yard grew littered with broken fences, smoking torches and blood, some theirs, some his. At dusk, a lull came. The riders pulled back to the ridge, their silhouettes black against the setting sun. The leader raised his voice again. Think on it, Miller. We'll be back at dawn, and when we come, we'll burn this place to the ground. No horse, no woman, no man will stop us then. Silence followed as they retreated into the dark. Ethan lowered his revolver, his arm trembling with exhaustion. Doc leaned against the barn wall, breathing hard, while Clara pressed a hand over her mouth, eyes wide with the weight of what tomorrow promised. Autumn stood in the center of the yard, her chest heaving, blood streaking her side, but her head held high. Her eyes blazed, not with fear, but with the same fire Ethan felt in his chest. She had no badge, no oath, no words, but she had chosen, as he had, to stand. The siege was not finished. It had only begun. Night fell heavy after the siege, but no one in the barn truly slept. The air inside was dense with smoke and fear, each creak of the wood sounding like a threat. Clara sat cross-legged on the floor, papers from the satchel spread before her, the lantern's dim glow illuminating columns of handwriting and stamped seals. She studied every page, as if the ink itself might fade if she looked away. Doc Green patched what wounds he could, his hands never still, his face drawn, but even his calm touch could not erase the exhaustion etched into them all. Ethan moved among them, silent as the shifting wind. He checked the revolver again and again, as though the rhythm of loading and counting was the only thing that could steady him. Yet his eyes kept drifting to Autumn. The mare stood tall despite her bleeding side, her breath rough but steady, her gaze unyielding. Every time he looked at her, Ethan felt a spark he hadn't known in years, a flicker of light against the dark weight pressing down. Around midnight, Clara spoke, her voice low but sharp with determination. "They'll be back at dawn. If we wait, they'll crush us. But if we move now, if we get these papers to someone beyond their reach, we still stand a chance." Doc frowned, shaking his head. "She's barely standing, and so are you. Running blind in the dark is suicide." Clara looked at Ethan, not the doctor. "You wore that badge once. You know better than anyone that waiting only gives them time to tighten the noose." The badge. The word cut deep, heavier than any bullet. Ethan touched the metal pinned beneath his coat. He had sworn the oath again, but oaths meant nothing if they weren't carried out. He thought of Sheriff Cole, hesitating, weighing politics against justice. He thought of neighbors who didn't yet know their wells were being poisoned, and he thought of the boy he had buried, the one he couldn't save. Maybe this was the chance to make sure another father didn't stand at another grave. Ethan exhaled slowly. "At first light, we ride." Not before Clara's shoulders sagged in frustration, but she didn't argue. She gathered the papers back into the satchel, tightening the straps as if securing her very soul. The hours that followed stretched endlessly. The wind whistled through the broken boards, and the prairie whispered secrets Ethan couldn't quite catch. He sat against Autumn's stall, his hand resting on her warm flank. She pressed against him gently, a wordless reassurance. He closed his eyes, and for the first time since his wife's passing, he prayed, not for himself, but for strength to hold until morning. When the first threads of dawn unraveled the darkness, the prairie glowed pale gold. The attackers had not yet returned, but their absence felt more dangerous than their presence. Ethan rose, holstered his revolver, and saddled the gelding. Clara tightened her coat around her shoulders, satchel strapped firmly across her chest. Doc handed Ethan a pouch of medical supplies and rested a hand on his shoulder. "You're walking into hell," Doc said. "I've been there before," Ethan replied. His voice was calm, but his eyes betrayed the storm within. Clara mounted Autumn, the mare's muscles quivering but her head held high. The sight of her, wounded, scarred, yet unbroken, struck Ethan like lightning. It was more than courage. It was defiance against the dark. As they rode out into the breaking light, Ethan glanced back once at the barn. Smoke still marked the boards, scars of the night past. But beyond the ruin, the horizon stretched wide and open. For the first time in years, he felt the pull of purpose stronger than the pull of grief. The flicker had become a flame. The first light broke across the Kansas plains like a blade of gold, cutting through the haze of smoke that still clung to the barn. Ethan rode at the front, his shoulders set, revolver at his side, the badge pinned beneath his coat, pressing into his chest like a second heart. Behind him, Clara clung to Autumn's reins, her satchel strapped close, her jaw tight with pain, but her eyes fixed ahead. Doc had stayed behind, his age and skill better suited to tending the wounded farmstead than galloping into another fight. The choice weighed heavy on Ethan, but he had not argued. The prairie stretched wide, the grass still wet from last night's dew, carrying the smell of ash and damp earth. Each hoofbeat echoed louder than it should have, as though the land itself was listening. Clara leaned low over Autumn's neck, whispering to the mare, and Autumn responded with steady strides despite her stitched wound. Ethan glanced back at her once, and in the rising light he saw something more than endurance in the animal's gaze. He saw a fierce loyalty, a refusal to yield no matter the cost. By the time they reached the ridge, Cedar Bluff lay ahead, quiet and unsuspecting. Smoke curled from chimneys, merchants swept their stoops, and the saloon doors swung lazily, as if the valley had not been touched by war. Yet Ethan felt the tension coiled in the air. Somewhere beyond these streets, men were waiting. Men who wanted Clara silenced, and the satchel buried forever. They rode straight to Sheriff Cole's office. The sheriff was outside, leaning against the post with his hat pulled low. When he saw them, his face tightened, though whether in relief or dread, Ethan couldn't tell. Clara slid from Autumn's back, wincing as her boots hit the dirt, and held the satchel up like a challenge. "You wanted proof," she said, her voice carrying down the empty street. "Here it is. Names, reports, orders signed by men in offices back east. While families here drink poison, Cole didn't reach for it." His eyes flicked from the satchel to Ethan, to the horse standing fierce despite her bandages. "You've made yourself a target," he said slowly. "Do you understand what happens now?" Ethan stepped closer, his shadow long in the morning sun. "It's not about me anymore. It's about them." He jerked his chin toward the homes, the church, the children chasing each other past the mercantile. "If we don't stand, they'll lose everything." The sheriff's jaw worked. For a long moment, silence stretched. Then the sound of hoofbeats shattered it. From the far end of the street, riders appeared, half a dozen, then more, their coats dark, rifles glinting. The company's men had come, bold as daylight. Townsfolk scattered, doors slammed, shutters snapped shut. Within minutes, Cedar Bluff looked like a ghost town. Every soul hiding from what was about to unfold. Cole's hand went to his gun, but his hesitation was plain. Ethan felt the old fire rise in his chest, a steady calm before the storm. He turned to Clara. "Stay behind me. And don't let go of that satchel." Autumn stamped the ground, nostrils flaring, as though she too understood the weight of the moment. Clara laid a hand on the mare's neck, whispering words Ethan couldn't hear, and the horse tossed her head high, eyes blazing in the morning light. The riders pulled up, their leader the same dark-coated man from before. His smile was gone, replaced by a sneer. "Miller," he called, voice sharp. "Hand over the woman and the papers, or we burn this town to the ground." Ethan stepped forward, the badge gleaming faintly beneath his coat. His voice carried clear, steady, unshaken. "You'll have to go through me first." A hush fell over the street. Even the wind seemed to pause. Sheriff Cole looked at Ethan, then at the townsfolk peering through cracks in shutters, their fear plain. And something shifted in his eyes. Slowly, deliberately, he drew his gun and stepped to Ethan's side. "You heard him," Cole said, his voice hard. "You'll have to go through both of us." The leader's sneer faltered. The standoff stretched, the sun climbing higher, shadows shrinking. And in that fragile silence, Ethan felt the stir of something he hadn't known in years. Hope, fragile but bright, like a flicker of light after fire. The battle was not yet over, but for the first time, he knew they were not standing alone. For a heartbeat, The whole of Cedar Bluff held its breath. Dust drifted in the sunlit street. A church bell clanged once in the wind, and then thought better of the moment. Ethan felt the badge against his chest like a steady pulse. Beside him, Sheriff Cole squared his shoulders, a man finished with counting costs. Across the way, the man. Company riders fanned out, rifles nudging higher, the dark-coated leader smiling the way a snake might when it thinks the field is its own. "Last chance," the man called. "Walk away." Ethan stepped forward so his boots drew 2 clean prints in the powdery road. "Not today." The first shot cracked the morning. A window somewhere shattered. A woman gasped behind a shutter. Cole answered a blink later, his pistol barking with the old confidence. The riders surged, careful lines breaking into chaos, hooves slamming the hardpan, muzzle flashes stuttering like lightning. Ethan moved the way his hands remembered, calm squeezing out through the noise. He felt each breath, each sight line, each decision travel from the ground to his shoulders like current through a wire. And then Autumn screamed. Clara was already moving, hugging the storefronts, the satchel tight against her ribs. A rider cut across to cut her off. Too fast, too sure of himself. Autumn lunged from behind Ethan as if she'd been waiting for the cue all her life. The mare crossed the dust in a heartbeat, rearing with a violence that tore the sun in two. Her hooves hammered the man's rifle aside. The second blow knocked him clean from the saddle. He hit the road and didn't rise. The dark-coated leader swung his carbine toward Clara. Ethan saw the angle, the bead of the barrel, the way doom takes its time. He didn't think. He shouldered forward and fired. The leader's hat went spinning. The bullet burned his ear, and the shot he loosed went high, chewing a crescent out of the hotel sign. Cole's next round clipped another rider's wrist. The gun clattered, the horse panicked, and 2 men collided and went down in a tumble of tack and curses. Autumn wheeled back to Clara, putting her body between woman and gunfire. The mare's wound tore open again. Scarlet streaked her flank. She did not fall. She looked at Ethan, steady, fierce, as if to say, "Finish this." The leader barked retreat to regroup, but his voice had thinned. He called for fire, for torches, for fear. But fear had already changed sides. Doors cracked, townsfolk peered out, measuring the odds with the blunt arithmetic of people who have run out of places to run. A shopkeeper slid a scattergun across his counter to an old hand. A young father stepped into the light with a broom handle and the posture of a man who will swing it until bone or wood gives way. On the church steps, Pastor Webb lifted his chin and didn't move. Ethan felt the town behind him like a tide. He raised his voice without looking back. No stray shots. No heroes alone. Hold the line Cole was cussing under his breath, a prayer threaded through it. Flank, he said, pointing with his chin. Ethan nodded. They moved together without needing the language, 2 men who had stood once on different dirt, but the same principle. They caught the riders in the alley mouth where velocity becomes trap. 3 clean shots, a shout, a tumble of reins. Horses bolted. Men dove for cover that wouldn't hold. The dark-coated leader saw the shape of the day and tried to salvage a piece of it. He swung wide for the girl and the papers, a vulture's arc tightening. Autumn tracked him. She was bleeding and beautiful, mane ragged with sweat, that singular light still burning behind her eyes. She cut him off with the economy only a creature born to open country can summon. He tried to shoulder past the mare, God's own mistake. She slammed him with a shoulder and a scream. He toppled backward, his carbine skittering. Ethan was there when he landed. "Call your men off," Ethan said, low and certain. The man spat blood and laughter. "You think a dusty badge and a broken horse can stop what's coming?" Ethan holstered his gun, slow. "No, truth will." He tapped the satchel against his boot with his other hand. "And a town that's done being afraid." Cole's shadow fell over them. "You're under arrest," he said, voice flat as a verdict. "And so are any of yours who don't leave their rifles in the street this second." For 2 long breaths, no one moved. Then a rider dropped his gun. Another slid from the saddle, hands raised. Men who had ridden in like thunder looked around and discovered themselves alone. Investors were far away. The river was near. The town was nearer still. The leader's sneer crumbled, not into fear, not yet, but into calculation. Even snakes know when a field is lost. He lifted both hands. It took the rest of the morning to bind wounds and names. Cole deputized 2 shopkeepers, then 3 more. Rifles were stacked like unfortunate fence posts, bolts pulled, chambers cleared. Pastor Webb brought water. Someone brought biscuits. Autumn stood beneath the hitching rail like a dark flame, guttering and refusing to go out. Clara pressed her forehead to the mare's, whispering gratitude that sounded like apology. By afternoon, the train whistle groaned from the east. Cole put the leader and 2 of his lieutenants on a freight car bound to the territorial judge with a guard who used to brand cattle and had since learned a different kind of iron. Before the door slid shut, the leader tried one last shape of power. "This town can't afford a fight," he said. "Men like me build rails and mills. You want roads? Loans? Insurance for your farms when the hail comes? You'll call us." Clara spoke for the first time since the shooting stopped. "We'll call an environmental attorney before we call a man who poisons children." She lifted the satchel. "And we'll call the newspapers." The door slammed. The train pulled. Dust rose and fell. In the weeks that followed, the stubborn work began. Samples from the river rode to Wichita and back in glass jars, labels tight, chain of custody clean enough to make any water quality testing lab nod. Clara wrote names and dates, and the human parts facts try to leave out. Coughs that never were cleared, wells that soured at dawn, a mother who learned to carry 2 buckets, one for washing and one for lips, who deserved better. A state man with a stiff collar came and pretended not to take notes, and still the notes got taken. The company sent lawyers who smiled like winter. Cole met them with straight-backed minutes and a ledger of seized rifles. The mercantile put a sign in the window. "No more credit to men who sell poison." A bank officer read the sign twice and decided to remember he had a conscience. An insurer no longer blinked at hail alone, but added water to the policy. An odd kindness that made old men shake their heads and call it progress. Ethan fixed the barn's bullet-chewed boards one by one. He worked in the cool mornings before the heat found his back. Autumn watched from the shade, stitches neat, coat growing glossy where the hair came in around the scar. Some evenings he led her to the river and let her drink, while the sun threw long coins across the current. He talked, and if anyone had asked, he'd have said he was foolish, but it is a particular grace to speak to a creature who already knows your worst, and comes closer anyway. Children began to come by, first in cautious pairs, then in brave clusters, to leave sugar cubes on Ethan's palm if he promised to share with Autumn. The mare learned the choreography of small hands and big awe, breathing fog onto knuckles and letting giggles turn the air bright. A boy asked if she could still run. Ethan wanted to say she never stopped. Instead, he smiled and said, "Fast enough." Clara's article ran in papers as far as Kansas City. A telegraph clacked news eastward, where men with tidy hairlines read it and frowned. It said nothing about gunfights. It said everything about water and names and a horse that stood between a bullet and the future. Donations came in envelopes that smelled like coal and paper glue. Someone wrote from Topeka, asking if the town would consider a public health meeting. Pastor Webb said yes before the ink dried. On a soft evening when the corn was shin-high and the river had the good sense to sound content again, Ethan walked Autumn to the hill where the farm looked honest and whole. The grave markers were there too, 2 stones, clean and plain. He touched them with the back of his fingers. "We did right," he said to the stones, and then, softer, to the mare. Autumn lowered her head until her cheek brushed his shoulder, as if to anchor him to the earth he was already part of. Footsteps in the grass. Clara, with dust on her boots and ink on her fingers, stopped a few paces away. "The judge issued injunctions," she said, a smile quick and tired. Discharge halted. Fines set. A grand jury impaneled. The town will testify. Ethan nodded, feeling a warmth that wasn't the sun. "You did that." "We did," she answered. "You. Cole Doctor. Autumn most of all." She stroked the mare's neck, the scar under her palm, raised line of history that didn't ask for pity. "I thought the story was about corruption. Maybe it's about staying the wind moved through the grass like a hand smoothing a child's hair." Distant laughter rose from the lane. Doc scolding boys who tried to climb his fence and failing to hide the smile in it. A hawk rode a current and did not flap. Somewhere below them, a woman rinsed apples in a bucket and tasted the water without flinching. "Sometimes," Ethan said, voice low, "the only way through is with someone who refuses to leave." He looked at Autumn. She looked back with that solemn intelligence that had led him to the door he swore he'd never open. "You brought her to my barn," he told the mare. "You brought me back to myself." Clara stood beside him without asking if she could. They watched the light drain slow from the day until the fields turned the color of a good night's rest. When they finally walked down the hill, Ethan did not feel the old weight press onto his shoulders. He felt the simple heft of a halter rope and the shy courage of a town that had decided it could love itself enough to fight. At the barn, Autumn paused, then nudged the door with her nose. Ethan laughed, really laughed, and opened it wide. Inside, the air held the clean scents of hay and oil and summer. No ghosts stepped forward, or if they did, they came as breeze and blessing. Ethan hung his hat on the same nail as always and ran a hand along the mare's jaw. "Easy, girl," he murmured, though the night offered no threat. "We're home." Autumn closed her eyes, leaning into the touch, and the last of the sun lifted from the ridge and went wherever good light goes when it has finished its work. The river kept its promise. The town kept its word. And the man who once locked his barn learned that some doors, once opened by an injured horse in a storm, should never be closed again. And now I want to hear from you. If Autumn's loyalty touched your heart, just leave a simple one in the comments. If Ethan's courage gave you hope, Type 0. Your words matter more than you think. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next story of humans and horses whose lives are forever intertwined. A new journey begins with the next video. Be there when it does.